This is my wedding, and I want her gone. Sloane's voice echoed through the venue speakers, cutting harshly over the string quartet. The heavy scent of white orchids and vanilla frosting hung thick in the warm air, suddenly suffocating. Someone clapped. Then another person joined in. Soon, half our family was applauding my public humiliation, their hands slapping together in a steady, wet rhythm. The stiff edge of the cream folder bit into my palm as I gripped it tighter. I did not cry in public, and I would not beg for a place where I was not wanted. I turned on my heel, letting the heavy silk of my dress sweep the floor, and started walking toward the exit. I refused to give Sloane the satisfaction of a reaction for her live stream cameras. The music had stopped completely now. I just needed to reach the heavy glass doors. Then the microphone cracked again. A man's voice this time. "Marcus, you did not invite her," the groom said. The room went dead silent. The rustling of expensive fabric stopped. Nobody breathed. "I did," he added. "Why?" Sloane's voice lost its polished edge, dropping into a sharp hiss. I stopped walking, the cold metal of the door handle resting against my skin. 6 weeks before that moment, my biggest problem was finding the time to answer a simple work email. I woke up at 5 a.m. in my own townhouse, the wooden floor feeling cold and grounding under my bare feet. I walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and opened my banking app. I transferred $300 into my father's separate care account. It was a fixed amount, sent every single month, keeping my finances entirely separate from my mother. I opened my laptop to check Dad's physical therapy schedule. An unread email sat at the top of my inbox. The clinic director was asking, for the third time, if I would accept the promotion to rehabilitation program manager. I left the message unread. Taking a management role meant unpredictable hours, and the care routine I had built for my father was far too fragile to survive a change in my availability. I opened my spreadsheet instead. I called it the care ledger. It was a habit born from years of medical documentation, a place where I tracked every appointment, every dollar spent, and every shift in his condition. I logged the morning transfer, closed the laptop, and went to get dressed for work. Later that afternoon, I stood in my parents' living room. Dad was sitting in his wheelchair, breathing heavily. His right arm rested in his lap, weak from the stroke 2.5 years ago. Sloane had her phone pointed at him. "Let us try that again," my sister said, adjusting her portable ring light. The angle on the first stand was not inspiring enough. "We need to see the struggle, Dad." I stepped directly in front of the lens. "He is practicing his mobility, Sloane. He is not performing." Dad reached for his speech tablet with his left hand. His movements were slow but deliberate. He pressed 2 buttons, and the synthesized voice filled the room. Flat, but clear. "Stop. Recording." Mom walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Oh, let her film, Erin. The video helps so many people understand what our family is going through." I did not argue. Arguing with Denise Caldwell was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. I just stayed in front of the camera, blocking the shot until Sloane lowered her phone with an exaggerated sigh. When I got back to my car, I pulled out my phone and opened the care ledger. I typed a new entry. Gerald Caldwell withdrew consent for video recording at exactly 3 p.m. Work was my only quiet place. The next morning, at the rehabilitation center, I spent an hour helping a patient learn how to hold a spoon again. The task required patience, a systematic approach, and absolute focus. As I washed my hands in the break room afterward, my boss leaned against the doorframe. "I need an answer on the program manager position by Friday, Erin." I dried my hands, tossing the paper towel into the bin. "I need a few more days to think about the hours." A coworker pouring coffee across the room shook her head. "You have to stop being the default rescuer for your family. You are allowed to have your own life." I nodded, though the guilt tasted like copper in my mouth. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came 3 hours later. I was walking a patient's mother out to the lobby. She stopped at the reception desk and smiled at me warmly. "I meant to say thank you earlier," the woman said. "I saw you are the clinical advisor for Daughters Who Care. The resources your sister posts are wonderful. It is really nice to know a real professional is guiding the charity." I forced a polite smile, assuming she had misunderstood a social media post. But the moment the glass doors closed behind her, I went straight back to my desk and opened a web browser. I typed in the address for my sister's nonprofit. I scrolled past the glossy photos of Sloan looking compassionate next to stock images of elderly patients. Halfway down the page, my own face stared back at me. Under the heading of Program Leadership, there was my name, my degrees, a description of my clinical experience that looked like it had been copied word for word from my professional resume. I did not pick up the phone to yell at my sister. Anger makes you sloppy. Instead, I took a screenshot of the page. I saved the website as a document, noting the exact date and time. My hands were perfectly steady as I clicked on a tab labeled Annual Report. The document downloaded to my desktop. I opened it and started reading. There was a chart on page 4. I recognized the numbers immediately. They were the exact hours of care, therapy milestones, and equipment costs I had tracked in my own care ledger over the past 2 years. Sloan had removed our father's name, presenting the raw data as if it represented dozens of different families receiving help from her foundation. Further down, a sentence I had written in a private email to my mother about the emotional toll of stroke recovery was featured in bold text. It was presented as an official quote from the nonprofit's clinical team. Still, I did not call her. I created a new folder on my desktop. I named it DWC Record. I moved the screenshots and the report inside, then uploaded a secure copy to an external drive. I was no longer just the older sister picking up the slack. I was documenting a severe problem. I scrolled to the very last page of the report, my breath caught in my throat. At the bottom of the financial summary, a single sentence sat in small print. It read, "Clinical Consultant Certification Attached." I stared at the words until the letters blurred together. I had never signed a certification in my life. The glow of the laptop's screen cast long shadows across my kitchen counter. I sat there for another 2 hours, completely still, mapping the digital footprint of Daughters Who Care. My fingers moved over the trackpad with deliberate precision. I saved the website source code, downloaded the annual report, and archived every social media post going back 18 months. I pulled the public list of board members. Then I opened my care ledger on the right side of the screen and placed the nonprofit report on the left. The dates lined up perfectly. Sloan had erased our father from the case studies. She had taken his specific physical therapy milestones, removed his name, and multiplied the entries. The data was packaged to look as though her foundation was actively managing recovery plans for dozens of separate families. I did not pick up the phone to scream at her. Anger was a luxury I could not afford right now. I built a timeline instead. The next morning, I called my mother. "Erin," Mom answered, the background noise of the television humming behind her voice. "Are you coming over for dinner? Your sister needs help addressing the wedding invitations." "Why is my name listed as the clinical advisor on the charity website, Mom?" The television went quiet. A long pause followed. "Sloan is just honoring you, sweetie," she said, her voice dropping into that familiar, soothing tone she used to smooth over broken vases and stolen credit cards. "She knows how hard you work with your father. She wanted to give you some public credit." "There is a note about a signed certification in the annual report," I said, keeping my breathing even. "I want to see it." The soothing tone vanished. "Do not do this, Erin." The sharp edge of my mother's real voice cut through the phone speaker. "Your sister is under a massive amount of stress with the wedding. Your father is finally having a good week. Why do you always have to look for a problem where there is none?" "No one forged anything. I will be requesting a copy in writing," I said. I ended the call before she could start crying. Then I opened my phone notes and typed out the exact time, duration, and content of the conversation. 2 days later, I sat across a heavy oak desk from Dana Brooks. At 44, Dana possessed the calm, terrifying energy of an attorney who specialized in dismantling corrupt nonprofits. She wore a dark blazer, and her eyes scanned the meticulously labeled folders I had placed between us. "Most people come into my office crying," Dana observed, flipping open the printed timeline. "You came in with metadata." "Crying does not fix falsified grant records," I replied. The attorney nodded slowly. She tapped a pen against the annual report. Dana identified 3 immediate risks. First, the unauthorized use of my professional identity. Second, the potential forgery of medical or financial records. Third, the legal liability hanging over my head if a grant had been awarded based on false clinical oversight. We do not go public yet, Dana advised, closing the folder. We do not have the original grant file, and we do not know the scale of the money involved. If we spook your sister, she will delete the servers. What do we do instead? We send a formal restriction demand, Dana said. We require them to remove your name, cease using your care logs, and produce any document containing your signature. We build the trap and see how they react. Walking out of Dana's office, the summer air felt lighter. For years, my entire existence had revolved around managing crises for the Caldwell family. That afternoon, I drove back to the rehabilitation center and knocked on the director's door. I accepted the final interview for the program manager position. Sitting in my car afterward, I logged into my bank and increased my emergency fund transfer. I also canceled a scheduled payment for an invoice my mother had sent me 2 weeks prior. The bill was vaguely labeled Wedding Caregiver Outreach, and I was done funding the illusion. Finally, I began researching independent respite care services for my father. Sloane's reaction arrived at exactly 6 o'clock that evening. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I let it go to voicemail, but it rang again immediately. I answered on the third try. "Aaron, what is wrong with you?" Sloane's voice trembled with forced tears. "A lawyer? Really? You are going to send a legal threat to a charity that is helping people? Remove my name from the website," I said, leaning against the cold granite counter. "I cannot just remove it without a board meeting," she snapped. "If I take down the clinical advisor page right before the wedding, the donors will get suspicious. Hundreds of families will lose their support because you are jealous of my success. Did you sign my name to a certification, Sloane?" The line went dead quiet. The heavy breathing on the other end told me everything I needed to know. "You have always hated that people love me," my sister finally whispered, her voice twisting into something ugly and cold. "You are going to ruin Dad's life if you push this." I hung up the phone. I saved the audio file of her immediate, frantic voicemail to the secure drive. The real shock came 3 days later. I was reviewing patient files at my desk when a new email appeared in my personal inbox. The sender name made my stomach tighten. Marcus Reed, my sister's fiancé. The message was formal, lacking any of the casual warmth he usually showed at family dinners. Marcus explained that he was writing in his official capacity as a trustee of the Reed Family Foundation. He needed to verify my specific role in their current grant cycle. He attached a PDF document and asked if I could confirm my signature before his board released the Phase 2 funding, which totaled $140,000. My hand hovered over the mouse. I clicked the attachment. It was a formal letter of commitment. The header named me as the unpaid clinical consultant for Daughters Who Care. And right there at the bottom of the page, above my typed name, sat my signature. I stared at the looping letters. The ink looked perfect at first glance, but I zoomed in, magnifying the document until the pixels blurred. The tail of the letter E had a tiny, rigid flaw. It was a habit I only used when signing thick, multi-page medical forms on a clipboard. I zoomed in further, inspecting the white space around the black ink. A faint, straight gray line hovered just a millimeter above the signature. It was a digital cut mark. Someone had not just forged my name. They had sliced a high-resolution image of my signature from a very specific old family document and pasted it directly onto a restricted grant application. I did not meet Marcus Reed at a coffee shop. When you are dealing with a private foundation grant and a forged signature, you meet in a room with a closed door and a lawyer present. Dana Brooks sat at the head of her conference table. The air conditioning hummed a steady, cold rhythm against the glass windows. Marcus sat across from me. He looked exhausted. The polished groom I knew from family dinners was gone. A man carrying a heavy leather binder sat in his place. He was not here to save my relationship with my sister. He was here as a trustee protecting his late mother's money. Marcus dropped the binder onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. The Reed Family Foundation approved a restricted grant for Daughters Who Care, Marcus began. His voice stayed low and measured. The total commitment is $420,000 over 12 months. The board requires absolute verification of clinical oversight before we release the next phase. I need to know if you signed this letter, Aaron. I never worked for Daughters Who Care, I said. I pushed the commitment letter across the table toward Dana. And I did not sign that paper. Dana placed a printed copy of my father's old emergency contact form right next to the grant document. I had pulled the medical file from my secure cloud drive earlier that morning. The two signatures were identical. They shared the same rigid flaw on the tail of the letter E. Someone had scanned the old medical consent form, cropped my name, and dropped it onto the grant application. Only 2 people possessed a digital copy of that specific contact sheet. My mother and my sister. The man across the table stared at the matching ink. His jaw tightened, a small muscle ticking near his ear. $280,000 has already been dispersed, Marcus said. His eyes remained fixed on the forged letter. Another $140,000 is pending a mid-year review. I can freeze the pending funds immediately. That action falls completely within my authority as a trustee. But demanding repayment for the money already spent requires a formal board investigation. Keep the investigation quiet for now, I requested. Do not give Sloan a reason to empty her filing cabinets until we secure the original records. Marcus agreed. He closed the leather binder with a soft click. We needed absolute proof of how my father's story was being manipulated. 2 hours later, Dana and I stood in my father's living room. An independent communication specialist stood beside us. Afternoon sunlight caught the dust motes floating near the window, illuminating the medical equipment stacked in the corner. The house smelled like sharp lemon polish, a scent my mother constantly used to mask the reality of illness. Gerald Caldwell sat upright in his wheelchair. His right hand rested on his knee, motionless, but his eyes tracked every person in the room with sharp, clear focus. The specialist asked simple, direct questions. My father understood every word. He used his left hand to tap the screen of his speech tablet. Did you consent to the fundraising videos? The specialist asked. Dad tapped the glass. The synthetic voice spoke. 1 time. Then no. Are they still recording you against your wishes? Another series of taps. Aaron cared. Sloan filmed. Stop recording. The mechanical voice lacked emotion, but the words carried a heavy, suffocating weight. My father knew exactly how his illness was being packaged and sold. He had just been trapped inside a body that refused to speak, surrounded by a family that refused to listen. Dana immediately suggested recording a formal witness statement. We were setting up the camera tripod when the front door swung open. Rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway. Denise Caldwell walked into the living room. She froze the moment she saw the attorney and the specialist. The color drained from her face, replaced instantly by a flushed, angry red. What is going on here? My mother pointed a shaking finger at Dana. You brought a lawyer into this house? Aaron, your sister will lose her entire charity if you drag outside people into our private business. I did not raise my voice. I did not apologize. Dad requested this meeting. He has a right to legal privacy. He does not know what he is agreeing to, she snapped. She stepped aggressively closer to the wheelchair. You are manipulating him. A sharp electronic chime cut through the room. We all looked down. My father's left hand hovered over the tablet. He pressed the speaker button again. My choice. The room fell completely silent. The woman who had spent 2 years speaking for her husband suddenly had nothing to say. Late that afternoon, I returned to Dana's office to review the financial disclosures Marcus had left behind. The paper trail was dense, filled with confusing categories, but one specific line item stood out on the expenditure report. The nonprofit had paid $118,000 to a company called Sloan Caldwell Media. The payment was vaguely categorized as an annual donor experience and caregiver documentary. Dana pulled up a secondary vendor list attached to that specific media production budget. The private company had outsourced the work. They planned to spend $112,000 on a venue, specialized lighting, and a professional video crew. The location is the Botanical Greenhouse, I noted. I traced the address with my finger across the printed page. And the event date is exactly the same day as Sloane's wedding. Dana frowned. She compared the numbers on both pages. The guest count for the supposed charity presentation matched my sister's wedding guest list almost perfectly. Marcus had mentioned earlier that Sloane claimed the donor event would take place in the afternoon, right before the wedding reception. It was a clever excuse to share the venue costs and mask the spending. I looked closer at the attached vendor proposal. The florist had included a digital mock-up of the therapeutic installation they were building for the charity event. The rendering featured massive, elaborate arrangements of white orchids and vanilla roses. Those were my sister's exact wedding colors. Dana turned to the final page of the proposal. There was a small, handwritten note printed near the bottom margin. The caterer had left a logistical reminder that completely shattered the charity event cover story. The note simply read, "Bride suite access begins at 8. The printed words on the vendor proposal sat between us like a physical threat. Bride suite access begins at 8. Dana traced the text with the tip of her silver pen, her expression completely unreadable. We spent the next hour mapping the exact flow of the foundation money. Marcus spread the bank transfer records across the conference table, and the architecture of the fraud finally became clear. The nonprofit did not pay the greenhouse directly. Instead, $118,000 left the charity account under the vague label of media production. That money went straight into a private corporate account owned by Sloane Caldwell Media. From there, my sister's company paid $112,000 to a collection of event vendors. The structure was brilliant in a deeply cynical way. It allowed Sloane to blend her wedding expenses with a supposed charity event, creating a wall of plausible deniability. "We still need the original itemized invoices," Dana cautioned, gathering the papers into a neat stack. Without the specific line items, she can claim the entire amount paid for the donor presentation. I nodded, knowing exactly where to start looking. I drove back to my townhouse and opened my laptop on the kitchen counter. I did not attempt to hack into any private accounts, and I stayed entirely within public social media pages. My search began with the specific florist listed on the grant expense report under the label of therapeutic installation. Finding the evidence took less than 10 minutes. The florist had posted a photo gallery 2 weeks prior. The images featured massive arches of white orchids and vanilla roses. The caption proudly announced a behind-the-scenes look at the custom mock-up for Sloane Caldwell's upcoming wedding. I saved the photos and documented the exact timestamps. The public posts created a strong suspicion. But Dana was right. We still needed the original invoices from inside the nonprofit office to prove intentional fraud. My phone buzzed against the granite counter. The screen displayed my mother's name. "Your father misses you," Denise said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Come over for dinner tonight. We are doing a final fitting for the bridesmaid dresses." The lie was so blatant it almost made me laugh. I had personally coordinated with the Independent Respite Agency earlier that afternoon, and I knew my father was currently attending an aquatic therapy session across town. He was not even in the house. "I will be there at 6, I replied, ending the call. I understood immediately that I was walking into a trap, but I needed to know exactly what they wanted from me. When I arrived at the suburban house, the air felt thick with tension. Sloane sat on the living room sofa wearing a soft cashmere sweater. She offered a practiced, gentle smile that did not reach her eyes. "I really want you standing next to us on the big day, Aaron," my sister murmured, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back just enough to break the physical contact. "What do you need, Sloane?" Denise walked out of the kitchen holding a thick cream envelope. The heavy paper looked expensive and official. She handed it to me with a dismissive wave of her hand. "This is just a standard media release for the family photos," my mother explained. "The photographer requires everyone to sign it before the ceremony." I opened the flap and pulled out the crisp documents. The first page looked normal enough, but I kept reading. The second page contained a dense block of legal text. According to the document in my hands, I was officially acknowledging my voluntary role as clinical consultant, confirming the submission of my care logs, and waiving all future claims against the foundation. Sloane hovered near my shoulder. "Just sign the bottom line, Aaron. The vendors are waiting for the final paperwork." I I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened the camera. I snapped a clear picture of the first page, then the second page. Finally, I photographed the signature line. The gentle smile vanished from my sister's face. Denise stepped forward, her posture rigid. "What on earth are you doing?" my mother demanded. "I need my attorney to review this," I said quietly. I set the unsigned document down on the glass coffee table. The facade of the peaceful family gathering shattered. Denise slammed her hand against the back of the sofa. Her voice climbed into a shrill, desperate register. She yelled that I was ruining everything, explicitly stating that the Reed Foundation grant would fall apart if I did not sign that exact paper before the wedding. Sloane immediately started crying, accusing me of sabotaging her happiness because I was bitter and alone. I did not raise my voice, and I did not try to defend myself against the familiar insults. I simply picked up my car keys and walked out the front door. I left the physical cream envelope sitting on the table, knowing I already possessed the high-resolution evidence I needed. I drove home in absolute silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The next morning, Dana projected the photos of the document onto the large monitor in her office. She magnified the image of the second page, focusing on the right margin. A faint gray box sat near the edge of the text. It was a printed draft comment that someone had forgotten to fully delete before hitting print. The first note read, "Make sure she signs the last page. Do not let her read the consultant section too closely." Directly beneath that instruction sat a reply from a different user account. "Leave it with me." The username attached to that reply was Denise Caldwell. My mother was not a clueless victim of Sloane's manipulation. The woman who raised me was an active, willing participant in the fraud. Dana leaned forward and pointed a finger at the top of the projected contract. "They are running out of time." I looked at the printed deadline sitting right above the signature line. The required date was exactly the same day as the wedding. They needed my signature on that paper before Marcus reviewed the grant file one last time. The next morning, stepping into the clinic director's office felt entirely different. The small room smelled heavily of sterile wipes and bitter coffee, a familiar scent that usually meant another exhausting shift. I sat across from my boss and accepted the promotion to Rehabilitation Program Manager. The new position offered standard weekday hours, finally allowing me to step away from the unpredictable night schedule I had maintained for years. Later that afternoon, a property manager handed me a renewed lease for my townhouse. I signed the paperwork without hesitation, transferring another solid block of savings into my emergency fund. Building an independent life was the only armor that actually mattered now. 2 days later, my father and I toured an accessible apartment downtown. The unit sat 3 blocks from the physical therapy center, featuring wide doorways and a modified bathroom. Gerald maneuvered his wheelchair across the hardwood floor, carefully inspecting the layout. I stood by the large window, watching his slow, deliberate movements. "I can coordinate a professional care team for the evenings," I told him, keeping my voice completely steady. "I will still visit, but I cannot be your full-time nurse anymore." My father reached for his tablet. The mechanical voice filled the quiet, empty apartment. "Daughter, not nurse." My mother knew nothing about this transition plan. We needed him safely moved before the storm broke over the family. That same Friday, Dana Brooks activated the trap. Sitting at her polished conference table, the attorney hit send on a formal document demand and a legal preservation notice. The digital envelope contained strict orders to freeze all charity emails, cloud servers, and financial drafts. Dana bypassed my sister completely, sending the legal documents directly to the nonprofit board chair and their corporate counsel. Sending that notice before the wedding meant declaring war, and Sloane retaliated almost instantly. My phone started buzzing relentlessly on Saturday morning. An aunt called to coldly inform me that my seat in the family pew had been reassigned. Then a cousin forwarded a social media video. On the screen, Sloane sat in her expensive car, wiping away perfectly timed tears. My sister told her followers that a bitter family member was trying to extort the charity and disrupt her upcoming wedding. I watched the video once, noting the carefully chosen words that hovered right on the edge of defamation. I refused to argue in the comment section. Instead, I released a short public statement denying any role as a clinical consultant and confirming my demand for a formal correction of the charity's records and the removal of my professional identity. Every hateful message sent my way went straight into an evidence folder. We still needed to identify exactly who manipulated the financial ledgers. Reviewing the digital metadata that evening, one specific user account kept appearing next to the altered document histories. Lily Chen. She was my sister's executive assistant, and her digital footprint covered every falsified annual report. I assumed Lily was a willing architect of the fraud, but Dana warned me not to jump to conclusions. Employees often processed illegal changes under direct orders just to save their jobs. The truth arrived at 9 o'clock that night. A blocked number flashed on my phone screen. I answered the call, hearing a ragged, panicked breath on the other end. "The legal notice arrived at the office today," Lily whispered, her voice trembling so badly I could barely understand the words. Sloane came in screaming. She ordered everyone to clear out the draft clutter before the board could review the files. My hand tightened on the phone. Lily explained that she had been terrified of becoming the scapegoat. The young assistant secretly bypassed the deletion order, downloading the entire administrative folder to a hidden drive. "She told me to delete everything after the wedding," Lily confessed, her words rushing together in the dark. A moment later, my email inbox chimed. Lily sent a single attachment to prove her story. I opened the file, staring at 2 identical invoices placed side by side. The original document billed the charity for bridal flowers. The updated version, sitting right next to it, showed the exact same dollar amount relabeled as a caregiver therapeutic installation. Lily walked into Dana Brooks's office the next morning, clutching a small silver flash drive like a lifeline. The young assistant sank into a leather guest chair, her hands trembling as she dropped the metal device onto the polished wood table. Dana plugged the drive into an isolated laptop, and a web of hidden folders populated the screen. Lily provided the unaltered original invoices, the complete calendar of file revisions, and a specific chain of text messages. One message from my sister read, "Do not send the full invoice to Marcus." "I changed the descriptions," Lily whispered, staring at the floor, but Sloane read every single alteration to me over the phone. Dana logged the source of the files and carefully placed the physical drive into an evidence bag. She never let me touch the raw data. The complete financial architecture finally sat exposed under the harsh office lights. Daughters Who Care had indeed transferred $118,000 to Sloane Caldwell Media. My sister's private company then funneled $112,000 to the greenhouse, the florist, the lighting technicians, and the video team. None of those bills separated the supposed charity presentation from the evening reception. According to an internal planning document we found in the folder, my sister intended to use a massive post-wedding fundraising push to quietly replace the missing funds. This was not an accidental administrative error. A deliberate functioning system of theft stared back at us. Marcus sat across the table, reading a printed copy of Sloane's email directives. He did not say a word for several minutes. The man looked completely hollowed out, realizing the woman he loved had built their wedding on a foundation of lies. "I need to speak with her," Marcus finally said, his voice tight. "Before the ceremony starts?" "Confronting her now gives her time to destroy the remaining servers," Dana warned, leaning forward. "She will intimidate her staff into changing their stories, and we will lose the paper trail." I watched the groom process the legal reality. The choice to marry was his alone. But the grant fraud was no longer a private family matter. Marcus nodded slowly, agreeing to hold the second disbursement and immediately inform the Foundation Council. Later that afternoon, the communications specialist helped set up a small camera in Dana's secondary conference room. My father sat facing the lens, wearing a crisp, button-down shirt. Dana started the recording, asking him to state his wishes for the official record. Gerald pressed the buttons on his tablet. The synthetic voice echoed in the quiet room. Erin cared for me. Sloane filmed me. I asked her to stop. She did not stop. He confirmed, using his printed yes and no cards, that he never consented to a donor event tied to a wedding reception. I did not hold his hand or turn the moment into a tearful display. My father deserved the dignity of speaking for himself, and he used his quiet strength to dismantle the public facade his youngest daughter had built. The retaliation attempt arrived at my townhouse that evening. Denise hammered on my front door just after sunset. When I opened it, my mother pointed a finger directly at my chest, threatening that Gerald would lose his home and his daily care if I caused a scandal with the charity. Instead of arguing, I handed her a thick manila folder. The pages inside contained the signed lease for the accessible apartment and the contracts for the independent professional caregivers. I watched my mother read the documents, her face draining of color as she realized my father no longer depended on her schedule or her finances. She had lost her primary weapon, and I did not provide the new address when she finally turned and walked back to her car. A thick envelope arrived via courier the following morning. Marcus had sent a formal invitation, printed on heavy cardstock, confirming I was his official guest. A handwritten note tucked inside explained that the foundation board chair would also be in attendance. Sloane had erased my name from the guest list, but she could not erase my name from the falsified grant file. Dana called me right after the courier left, asking if I preferred to stay home and let the lawyers handle the fallout. I declined the offer. Staying home meant allowing my sister to spin my absence into an admission of guilt. I had to face her. The morning of the wedding dawned humid and bright. My phone vibrated against the bedside table, lighting up the dark room. A text message from Sloane flashed across the screen. "Bring a pen. You will sign before I walk down that aisle." I chose a simple silk dress for the ceremony, intentionally avoiding the bright, loud colors that would draw attention to my presence. The original evidence remained locked securely in Dana's office vault, leaving me to carry only a single folder containing a few necessary copies. I shared my real-time location with my attorney and disabled my cloud access on my phone, ensuring no one could remotely wipe or tamper with my data if they managed to grab the device. The greenhouse smelled like expensive lilies and impending rain. Crystal chandeliers hung from the glass ceiling, casting harsh light over rows of white chairs. Dana sat near the back beside the foundation council, close enough to see the podium, but far enough to stay outside the family spectacle. I recognized the floral arrangements immediately. Every archway, every table centerpiece, matched the items on the falsified invoice we had recovered from Lily. Sloane spotted me near the entrance. She looked radiant, but her eyes narrowed the moment she registered my arrival. She did not approach me directly. Instead, she signaled to Denise. My mother hurried over, her face set in a mask of rigid concern. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into a small side room behind the main staging area. "You are going to sign the release," Denise hissed, slamming a fresh stack of papers onto the table. I scanned the top document. They had adjusted the wording, adding a new clause that forced me to accept full financial responsibility for the grant report errors. "I will not sign a lie," I replied, keeping my voice flat. Denise leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and panic. She warned me that she would tell every person in the building I had threatened the charity just to squeeze money out of the foundation. I took a steadying breath, reached into my bag, and silently clicked my voice recorder. I kept the device out in the open, resting it on the table between us. My mother stumbled back as if I had struck her, her eyes darting toward the open door where a few guests stood chatting. She realized she could not risk a scene. "You have some nerve," Denise spat, backing out of the room. "Sloane will destroy you for this." I walked back into the main ceremony area just as Marcus stepped out from the groom's quarters. He looked pale. He had not signed the marriage license yet. He was searching for Sloane, intending to confront her about the grant before the ceremony became official, but my sister moved through the crowd like a shark, intentionally blocking his path with a steady stream of wedding planners and relatives. He locked eyes with me from across the room, and the look of hollow realization on his face told me he already suspected the truth. Suddenly, Sloane broke free from the planners and marched toward the front podium. She did not wait for the music. She grabbed the microphone, her voice amplified and sharp. She began detailing a story about a family member who was trying to extort money from the charity and sabotage the wedding. "This is my wedding, and I want her gone," she declared, pointing a manicured finger directly at me. Denise stood up in the front row, loudly confirming every word. A ripple of applause moved through the crowd. Sloane gestured to the security guards standing by the exit. I realized they had been warned about me before I even entered the building. I looked at the crowd, turned and started walking toward the door. I had no interest in becoming content for her live stream. I reached the exit, but Marcus surged forward, his hand snapping onto the microphone before the security guards could reach me. "You did not invite her," Marcus said, his voice ringing against the glass walls. The sudden stillness in the room was absolute. "I did," he added. Sloane paled, her grip on the podium tightening until her knuckles turned white. She leaned into the microphone, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" Marcus ignored her and gestured for the board chair to stand up. He looked at the folder in my hand, then at the audience. He held the microphone steady, his eyes cold. "Because her name is on a restricted grant now tied to invoices for this venue, and she says her signature was forged." The microphone hummed with static as Marcus stood at the center of the room. He did not look at Sloane. He focused on the board chair, who had frozen halfway to the podium. "I am a trustee of the Reed Family Foundation," Marcus announced, his voice steady despite the visible tremor in his hands. "We placed a restricted grant with this organization. That funding was meant for caregiver support. I have kept the second phase of that grant on hold, and I am requesting a formal audit of all project expenditures." My sister stood paralyzed behind the podium, her jaw locked. She finally looked toward the back of the room, scanning the crowd for a sympathetic face, but the guests simply stared back, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to guarded shock. Marcus turned to face me, nodding once. "I invited Erin because she is listed as our clinical consultant. Yet she was absent from your official guest list. I needed to verify her professional participation." I walked toward the podium, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes. I did not look at my mother, who sat slumped in her chair, her hands clutching her purse until the knuckles went white. I stopped at the microphone, placed my folder on the stand, and spoke clearly. "I have 3 facts for the record," I said. "First, the professional care logs used in the annual report were written by me, without my knowledge or consent. Second, the signature on the grant agreement is a forgery. Third, I requested that my identity and data be removed from these projects 3 months ago." I slid the thick evidence packet across the wood, pushing it directly toward the Foundation Council. "Everything else belongs in an audit, not a wedding speech." Sloane lunged for the microphone, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "She is lying!" my sister shrieked. "She has been demanding money from me for months because she is bitter about her own failed life. She tried to extort the charity." I did not take the bait. I stepped back, letting the silence of the room frame her outburst. The board chair cleared his throat, leaning toward the stand. "Sloane, we are looking at the vendor invoices for this event. There is a payment here for $118,000 from the charity account to your media company. Why does the lighting, video, and venue package for today appear under those specific expense codes?" Sloane spun around to face Lily, who stood trembling near the back table. "Delete the grant folder!" Sloane screamed, her voice cracking under the pressure. "Get rid of the entire media drive, now!" The room held its breath. Lily stood perfectly still. The assistant took a deep, measured breath and folded her arms across her chest. "I cannot do that," Lily said. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers. "The Nonprofits Council and the Reed Foundation Council already have the original files. Erin's attorney sent a preservation notice yesterday afternoon. If I delete anything now, I become part of the cover-up." Lily pointed toward the board council. "I have the original version of those invoices, and I have the text messages documenting every change Sloane ordered me to make." My sister's shoulders slumped. She looked around, realizing the board members were no longer listening to her. They were examining the documents Lily had provided. The trap had closed. Sloane gestured toward the front row, her eyes darting to my mother. "Mom told me Erin would sign," Sloane shouted. "She said Erin would never take this outside the family." Denise let out a sharp, guttural sound, dropping her purse to the floor. The sound of contents spilling across the hardwood echoed like a gunshot. "Cut the live stream," the board chair commanded, pointing toward the production table. The public feed went black. Then Foundation Council loaded my father's recorded statement onto the venue screen. His image filled the greenhouse, his voice calm and steady despite the mechanical filter. "Erin cared for me. Sloane filmed me. I asked her to stop. She did not stop. He repeated the words once more, his eyes steady on the camera. The applause from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of realization. Marcus stepped away from the podium and placed the wedding band on the table. "This wedding is over," he said. He did not look at me or turn the moment into a scene of shared intimacy. He simply walked away from the altar, leaving the ceremony in tatters. The board chair rose, signaling for Sloane to surrender her foundation equipment and keys. My sister turned, running toward the service exit, the same door she had tried to force me through minutes earlier. She vanished into the hallway, leaving behind the wreckage of a life built on shadows. When the greenhouse finally emptied, only Dana and I remained. My attorney pulled out her tablet, displaying an email that Lily had forwarded mere seconds ago. It was a digital copy of a draft document my mother had sent to the office. The first line of the email from Denise read, "Use Erin's signature. She will never take this outside the family." I looked at the screen, watching the words burn into my mind. The betrayal was complete. I closed the laptop, felt the cool air of the greenhouse against my skin, and knew the war had finally turned in my favor. The greenhouse felt like a tomb after the guests departed, filled with the scent of wilting orchids and broken dreams. 1 week later, the storm had settled into a cold, clinical reality. The nonprofit board suspended Sloane, locking her out of the email servers, bank accounts, and all official communication channels. They installed an interim director to ensure the families currently receiving services did not suffer during the transition. But the days of Sloane Caldwell Media dictating the charity's narrative were over. I stayed far away from the press releases. I did not take over the board, and I did not seek the spotlight. Marcus confirmed that the foundation would now provide direct assistance to the qualifying families until the audit concluded, ensuring the funds actually reached the people who needed them most. The forensic audit arrived in midsummer, cold and devastatingly thorough. Accountants meticulously compared the restricted grant funds, bank transfers, and original vendor confirmations. They identified that $118,000 had flowed from the charity to Sloane Caldwell Media, which then paid the $112,000 wedding vendor package. The audit confirmed that $96,800 of that total went directly toward personal wedding expenses, while $15,200 could legitimately be tied to donor presentations. Another $21,400 in media costs lacked sufficient documentation and remained under investigation for potential recovery. My sister attempted one last desperate maneuver by trying to frame her assistant. She claimed Lily had altered the invoices without her knowledge. Lily responded with a devastating silence, followed by a mountain of evidence. The assistant turned over emails, internal calendar versions, and a voicemail where Sloane explicitly instructed her to replace the money after the wedding. The defense crumbled. Denise fared no better when Dana confronted her in the following weeks. My attorney presented the email chain where my mother had sent the original consent forms, along with the care logs and photographs she had sourced for the grant application. The draft release containing the note about leaving the signature acquisition to her, paired with the voicemail pressuring me to remain silent for the sake of the family reputation, painted a clear picture of her complicity. My mother tried to play the martyr, claiming she only wanted to save the family from public shame. I stared at her across Dana's desk, feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. "You did not save the family, Mom," I said. "You saved the image of a daughter who was using her own father as a prop." The legal consequences began to tighten. My father moved into the accessible apartment we had secured, surrounded by professional caregivers who respected his autonomy. He formally revoked my mother's power to use his likeness, access his medical files, or make decisions on his behalf. A professional fiduciary took over his financial oversight, leaving Denise without the leverage she had used for years to keep me tethered to that house. The final blow came in the form of a settlement offer. Lawyers for Sloane and Denise contacted Dana, proposing a deal. They offered to pay back the misappropriated funds, cover my legal fees, and provide a formal apology, provided I signed an expansive non-disclosure agreement. The contract would have silenced me regarding my father's medical abuse, the grant fraud, and my mother's active role in the deception. Dana sat with me in her office, outlining the reality of the offer. I could take the money, sign the papers, and walk away with a clean financial slate, or I could refuse and let the legal process grind forward through months of depositions and discovery. I looked at the settlement paperwork. The total was enough for a significant down payment on a house, a way to build a life completely unburdened by the debt my family had accrued. I thought of the long years spent tracking medical appointments in my care ledger, the nights I spent sitting by my father's bed while my sister took photos for her social media feed, and the way the synthetic voice on his tablet had pleaded for silence. I remembered him looking at me, his eyes clear and tired, and saying those words that changed everything. My choice. I placed a pen on top of the stack of documents. Dana watched me, her expression unreadable. I took a deep breath, the air in the office feeling thin and sharp. "I have one condition," I said, my voice echoing against the quiet walls. I was not going to ask for more money. I was not going to demand they worship the ground I walked on. I wanted terms that returned control of the truth to the people they had exploited. The settlement would require a full public correction of the consultant records, the permanent removal of my father's data, payment of my legal fees, and Sloane's resignation from Daughters Who Care. She would never return to its board or use our family story for paid content. Any broader restriction on nonprofit financial management would have to come from the state regulator or the court. I watched Dana start to draft the new terms. The path ahead would be long, but for the first time in my life, the road belonged entirely to me. The legal negotiations lasted several months. Sloane signed the civil settlement in late autumn. She repaid the misused funds, covered my legal fees, surrendered her position at Daughters Who Care, and agreed never to use my father's image or my professional identity again. The board terminated her for cause. Sponsors and media partners withdrew, and Sloane Caldwell Media collapsed under the cost of repayment, lost contracts, and legal fees. The audit was also referred to the state charity regulator and the district attorney. Sloane later accepted a plea agreement for falsifying business records and misusing charitable assets. She received supervised probation, restitution, and community service. A separate consent order barred her from controlling nonprofit finances for 10 years. She did not go to prison, but she lost the platform, authority, and curated lifestyle she had built from my father's suffering. My sister eventually accepted responsibility for Kai Baosai, which included the fraudulent grant applications, the falsified signatures, and the misuse of charitable assets. Her punishment involved a combination of restitution, a period of supervised probation, and a permanent ban from serving in any financial management role for a nonprofit organization. She was forced to perform hundreds of hours of community service, working in roles that offered no platform for self-promotion. Watching her navigate that new, anonymous reality provided a different kind of closure than a prison sentence ever could have offered. 3 weeks after the final signatures were filed, Sloane appeared at my father's apartment. She brought a professional camera crew, clearly hoping to film an emotional redemption story she could sell to the highest bidder. My father sat in his wheelchair by the window, the autumn light catching the silver in his hair. He looked at the lens pointed toward his face, his expression completely unreadable. He reached for his speech tablet. "Turn it off," the mechanical voice said. Sloane hesitated, forcing a tremulous smile for the camera, but my father tapped the screen again. "Turn it off," he repeated, his hand slamming down onto the armrest. The camera operator finally lowered the lens, giving the order to stop recording. The room grew deathly quiet. "Now apologize," my father said, his voice flat and devoid of the performance she demanded. Sloane stumbled over her words. She tried to revert to her practiced, scripted explanations, but without an audience, the rhythm of her deceit fell apart. She blamed the pressure, the vendors, and even my mother, but her voice lost all conviction when she looked into my father's steady, unblinking eyes. He simply shook his head and gestured toward the door. She left without another word, losing the last source of content that had fueled her rise. Denise stopped by a few days later, her posture diminished, her clothes looking worn for the first time in my memory. She sat at my father's kitchen table and started listing the mounting costs of her lifestyle, asking me to cover her mortgage payments and the legal fees she had incurred during the audit. I stood by the counter, watching her carefully. "I will pay for the things Dad chose for himself, but I will not pay for your life," I said. My mother accused me of abandoning the family, her voice rising in that familiar, frantic pitch. I shook my head, my resolve stronger than it had ever been. I am not abandoning you, Mom. I am returning your consequences to you. I walked her to the door and watched her drive away, knowing that for the first time, she would have to face the life she had built without my silent, sacrificial labor to prop it up. 6 months after the wedding that never was, my life had settled into a quiet, manageable rhythm. I managed the rehabilitation program with a clear head, enjoying the structure and the tangible progress I saw in my patients every single day. My townhouse remained a sanctuary, a place where I came home to silence and peace instead of a backlog of family crises. One Saturday afternoon, I visited my father. He was reading a book by the window, his expression relaxed. I sat down on the sofa, picking up a magazine while he worked on his crossword puzzle. I had left my care ledger in the top drawer of my desk at home. I did not need the paper trail anymore to prove I was doing my job or to protect myself from accusations of neglect. Nonprofit organizations often reached out, asking me to join their boards or share my experiences with caregiver documentation. I politely declined the positions of power, preferring to stay in the background, but I agreed to lead a single seminar on the importance of medical documentation and patient consent. Marcus sent a brief handwritten card thanking me for the truth, but we never spoke again. The trauma of the situation had acted as a clean cut, separating his life from my own for good. My father looked over at me, his eyes bright and focused. He reached for his tablet and typed out a question. No paperwork? I set the magazine aside, feeling a lightness in my chest that had been absent for years. I smiled at him, the weight of a decade finally lifting from my shoulders. Not today, Dad, I said. Today, I am just your daughter. Walking away from a cycle of family betrayal is perhaps the most difficult professional and personal surgery you will ever perform, but it is often the only path toward genuine recovery. You have witnessed how easily a person can be reduced to a tool, a source of data, or a convenient scapegoat when others prioritize their own image over your humanity. The lesson here is not that you should stop caring or stop helping, but that you must learn to distinguish between genuine support and sacrificial exploitation. Protecting your boundaries is not an act of selfishness. It is a fundamental requirement for maintaining your own integrity. You must recognize that when you act as the default caregiver or the silent fixer for others, you are essentially training them to disregard your needs. Real care is never a one-way street, and the moment you find yourself documenting your every move just to survive a family dynamic, you have already transitioned from a loved one to a target of convenience. Your time, your professional expertise, and your emotional energy are resources that deserve protection, not endless extraction. When you force others to face the natural consequences of their own actions, you are not being cruel. You are finally offering them the only opportunity they have to grow up. True strength is found in the ability to build a life that stands on its own foundation, independent of the family members who have made their stability dependent on your exhaustion. You cannot heal a broken family dynamic by sacrificing your own future to keep their secrets or to fund their facades. Instead, you reclaim your agency by meticulously keeping your own records, separating your finances, and refusing to sign away your rights to accommodate someone else's convenience. It takes immense courage to look at the people you are supposed to trust most and say that you will no longer accept the burden of their choices, but doing so is the only way to transform from a silent sufferer into the architect of your own peace. You deserve to be seen for who you are: a daughter, a professional, a person, rather than a vessel used to carry the weight of a broken family's secrets. It is time to stop carrying the ledger of everyone else's mistakes and start writing the pages of your own life. Have you ever felt that the people who should be protecting you are the very ones profiting from your silence? And if so, what is the first boundary you need to set today to begin reclaiming your own story?